Spongy bone can go by three different names, all referring to its appearance. Obviously, the term spongy refers to the network of thin bone struts known as trabeculae, which spread out like the interior of a sponge. This is also known as trabecular bone, trabecula referring to a Latin word meaning little beam, also known as cancellous bone, that word originally meaning lattice. And so all three of these terms refer to this spongy structure. A different type of bone known as compact bone makes up the majority of the skeleton. It forms the outside of all bones and the shaft or diaphysis of long bones. Under the microscope, compact bone is made of osteons, where there are these bone salts known as lamellae, which form circular cylinders. They are concentric, all surrounding blood vessels. And this structure, these concentric lamellae around blood vessels, is known as an osteon. Spongy bone lacks osteons, so the bone salts are not organized in these concentric cylinders, but rather as these thin struts known as trabeculae, that little beam reference, also known as lamellae. And so these are oriented along lines of stress. So in, say, the head or epiphysis of the femur, if you were to study modern dance, the stresses that you put upon the head of the femur would change, and thus you would have to form new trabeculae to support stresses from these new directions. These thin struts of bone have small channels known as canaliculi opening into spaces from which the bone cells can get their oxygen and their nutrients. And in these spaces, marrow and blood vessels are contained. Spongy bone composes 20% of the human skeleton, including the epiphyses of long bones and the interior of some other bones, such as skull bones, vertebrae, ribs, and pelvic bones. Obviously, this spongy bone makes the skeleton lighter than it otherwise would be if it were all composed of compact bone. Blood is made in the red bone marrow in some of the spaces surrounding this spongy bone. This is very important since every single second millions of red blood cells die, many millions more of white blood cells die and need to be replaced. So our red bone marrow is a place where we are constantly replenishing our blood cell populations. The areas of spongy bone which have red bone marrow, as opposed to the yellow bone marrow which stores adipose, changes over the course of our life. When we're younger, all of our bones contain red bone marrow, while in adults, the regions of red bone marrow are more restricted. Should we suffer blood loss, some of the areas which are yellow marrow could briefly convert into red bone marrow once again.